A homeless nun knocked at dawn whispering, "Please feed them." The farmer set 6 bowls. The bowl was chipped on the left side, had been since Clara threw it at me in '83, and I never replaced it because it held oatmeal just the same, and because throwing things out felt like waste. I was filling it the morning the woman knocked, the sound small, 3 taps, not the hard fist pound of a man with trouble or the flat slap of the wind pulling at loose boards. 3 taps, careful taps. The kind a person makes when they're not sure they have the right to knock at all. I set the bowl down and stood still a second. 6 o'clock, maybe a little past. November light just starting to gray the east window, ice on the inside corners of the glass because I'd been slow getting the second storm sash up, and the cold had found its way in the night before. The stove was going, but it took a while to beat back the corners of a room that size. I didn't get many visitors, hadn't in some years. I pulled the door open and there she was. She was wearing the habit, the black and white of it, but the white coif was dirty along the bottom edge, and the black wool was wet through at the shoulders, and she was shaking with it. Not trembling. Shaking, the way a man shakes when he's been cold for too long and his body stopped being polite about it. She was maybe 50, maybe less. It's hard to tell with nuns. Something about how they carry themselves makes the age harder to read. Her eyes were dark and direct, and she didn't look away when she met mine, even though she was standing there in a state that most folks would have bowed their head from. She said very quietly, "Please, I have children." I looked past her. The yard was gray and empty. She'd come up from the south road. I could see the tracks in the frost on the dead grass, a single set, hers, and then to the right, beyond the fence line where the old walnut tree stood bare, something moving. Small figures in the tree's shadow, 6 of them, hunched and closed together, not making any sound that carried. I said, "Come in." She turned and made a small motion with her hand, and the figures came. They walked in a line, the smallest in the middle, a child young enough that an older girl was carrying her on her hip. I stood in the doorway and they filed past me into the kitchen, quiet as cattle going into a barn, and each of them looked up at me as they passed. The particular look children give an unknown man, measuring and watchful and not yet decided. I closed the door. My name is Harlan Cade, and I have farmed this ground for 31 years. Before that, I was a young man doing things I don't particularly want to put a name to. And before that I was a boy on a farm 50 miles north who watched his father work himself into the ground, and figured that was the shape of a life, and wasn't wrong. I am 62 years old. My hands are the color of the walnut tree outside. My wife Clara died in 1889 of a thing that started in her chest in February, and by June had taken her to the end of what I could do, which wasn't enough. We had no children that lived. The farm is 340 acres, most of it creek bottom, the rest upland, and I work it alone because I cannot see making a hired man's life out of what I do when I can still do it myself. There is a particular thing in being able to manage your own ground alone that I am not ready to give up. I say all of this so you understand what the house was when that woman knocked on my door. Quiet, set in its ways. A single bowl on the counter, 1 chair pulled to the table, a fire built for one man's warmth. 31 years of mornings, I had walked out of that house into my own ground and walked back into it in the evening, and it had been enough, or near enough, and I had gotten careful about the difference. Her name was Sister Agatha. She'd been at a mission school outside of Harwick, a day and a half east of my place, and she said the word "been" carefully, meaning past tense, meaning it was gone. I didn't press. There was a way she said it that let me know she'd tell me the whole of it when the children were settled and not before. The children, 2 girls of maybe 12 and 10, twins from the look of them with the same cut to their jaws. A boy of about 8 who had a bruise along his left cheekbone that was 3 days old at least, yellow at the edges. A thin girl of 6 who barely spoke. The one who'd been carried, maybe 3, who went straight for the warmth of the stove without any shyness. And an older boy, 14 or so, who stood near the door with his arms folded and watched me the way the 14-year-old boy, who's decided he's the man of something always watches a stranger. I understood that. I said to the older boy, "There's wood in the porch. Could use more brought in." He looked at me, looked at the door. Then he unfolded his arms and went. I got the oatmeal going in the big pot. Clara's big pot, the one I never used anymore because it was built for company. I put the chipped bowl aside and went to the high shelf for the others. 6 bowls. Set them on the table. Found the honey jar and the pitcher of canned cream from the cold box and set those too. Sister Agatha was at the far end of the kitchen, unwrapping the 3-year-old from a shawl that was damp through, rubbing the child's hands between both of hers, talking low in a tone that wasn't words so much as sound. The sound a woman makes to say "I have you. We are all right, stay close." The child had her eyes on me across the kitchen, large and not frightened, just watching. I kept my back to them. Most of the time I was working the stove. Not because I was unsettled, but because I knew that a big man moving free in a kitchen is less alarming when he's got his back turned, and they can watch without being watched. The boy came back in with an armful of wood, set it by the stove without being asked. I said good and meant it. They ate. God, they ate. The twins ate carefully, with a deliberateness that told me they'd been taught manners and hadn't forgotten them even hungry. The 8-year-old with the bruise ate with his head down and one hand on the bowl, the way you eat when you're not sure it won't be taken. I noticed that. The thin girl of 6 picked at hers until the older twin touched her elbow and said something I couldn't hear, and then she ate. The little one, the 3-year-old, got oatmeal on her chin and on the table and didn't care. The 14-year-old ate like a man, steady and without stopping, and when his bowl was empty he looked up at me and I looked at the pot and he helped himself to a second. Sister Agatha ate last, after everyone else, which told me something about her. I refilled the stove, found the bread I'd baked 2 days prior, sliced it all and put it on the table with the butter. Nobody said anything about it being a lot. It was a lot, but nobody said anything. After the children sat, the littlest had fallen asleep against the oldest twin's arm. The 8-year-old was watching the fire through the stove grate. I sent the 14-year-old, his name was Thomas, he told me when I asked, Thomas Reese, to the barn with instructions about the horses. Check the water trough, fork a half bale into each stall. He didn't hesitate. Kid had work in him. I could see it. Then it was me and Sister Agatha at the table. She told me. The mission school had been a frame building on the edge of a creek bottom, 3 classrooms, a kitchen, small dormitory rooms for the 8 children in their care, and 2 other sisters besides herself. It had been operating for 4 years under the diocese out of the territorial capital, funded in pieces, always a little short. The previous month a man named Greer had come with papers saying the land the mission sat on was his, had been his, that the church's claim was a clerical error from the original survey. Whether that was true, she didn't know. What she knew was that Greer had come back 10 days later with 3 other men and told them they had until morning. The 2 other sisters had gone south toward the mission's mother church with the church records. Sister Agatha had gathered the children, these 6, the ones who had no family to go back to, and walked. She'd been walking north and west for 9 days. She had money enough for 2 more days of food, and she'd been sleeping them in barns and once in a root cellar, and they were not sick yet, but the cold was getting worse. She said all of this with her hands flat on the table, her voice level and her eyes on me. Not performing composure, actually composed. The kind of composed that's been walked into by necessity and has had 9 days to set hard. I said, "How'd you find this place?" She said a woman in the last town had told her there was a farm north on the creek road, that the man there was solitary but not mean. She'd said it like it was a distinction worth making. I sat with that a minute. I said, "You and the children will stay here until we figure the next step." She looked at me, just looked at me for a few seconds with those direct dark eyes. She said, "I cannot ask you for that." I said, "You didn't ask." I said, "I'm not going to tell you that it was easy or that I had some ready plan. I had a farmhouse with one bedroom that was mine and a second bedroom that had been Clara's sewing room for the last 7 years, and before that a bedroom we'd never needed. I had a barn with a loft that was well chinked and warm with the animals below. I had a root cellar with enough laid by for one man's winter, and then some, because I always put up more than I needed out of a habit of mind I couldn't break. What I had was enough. That was the plain truth of it. For one man I had more than enough, and here were 7 people standing in the cold. Thomas and I spent the afternoon bringing the sewing room furniture to the barn loft and hauling the 2 beds from the loft. I had 2 old iron frame beds up there from when I'd had a hired man, years ago, down to the sewing room. I found every extra blanket in the house and a buffalo robe from the chest at the foot of my bed that I hadn't touched since Clara died. Sister Agatha made up the beds. She worked quick and without fuss, shaking the blankets out with a snap of her wrists, tucking them the way women tuck things, with a sureness that has nothing to do with hurry. The children were sorted. The 2 older girls and the 6-year-old in one bed, the little one and the 8-year-old, whose name was Samuel, in the other. Thomas would sleep in the barn loft, which he chose himself and seemed to prefer, and I'd made him a pallet out there that was warm enough. That left Sister Agatha. I said she could have my room. I'd sleep on the kitchen floor near the stove. She said she would not take my bedroom. I said there was nowhere else. She said she'd sleep in the chair by the stove. We looked at each other. She was not going to move on that point. I could see it the way you can see when a fence post is set deep. So I said, "Fine," and found the blanket off the top shelf in the closet and set it on the chair nearest the stove, and she thanked me, and I went to bed. I lay in the dark that first night and listened to my house. It was a different sound. Not loud, the children were asleep early, worn through, but there was breathing in it, the particular shift and settle of people distributed through a building that wasn't used to them. A floorboard once. The creak of the chair by the stove, turning. Wind at the window, same as always, but landing differently in a room with someone else awake. I hadn't realized how much silence had weight until there was something to press against it. I thought about Greer and his papers and 3 men and a night deadline, and I thought about 9 days walking in November cold with 6 children. I thought about what kind of man looks at a woman in a habit with 6 children and hands her a deadline. I thought about it for a while, and then I put it away, the way you put tools back, because thinking about it in the dark wasn't useful. What was useful was the morning. The farm ran on routine, and I kept to it, or tried to, with the addition of 7 people and the considerable adjustments that required. I was up before light. Thomas was already in the barn when I got there. I heard him moving before I opened the door, the sound of a fork in hay, and he'd done the water and fed the horses and was starting on the stalls. I stood in the barn doorway and looked at him for a moment. 14 and doing a man's work in a stranger's barn before dawn. I thought about what that cost a boy, the particular arithmetic of it. I said, "You want to learn to milk cows?" He said, "I already know them." I said, "Then do it." He did. Sister Agatha had breakfast started when I came back in. She'd found the salt pork in the cold box and had it going with eggs from the crock I kept on the cellar shelf, and the bread was sliced, and she'd found the coffee without my telling her where it was. She moved in my kitchen like a woman who knew kitchens, efficiently and without crowding, and she stepped aside when I came to the stove to check the fire without making it a thing. The children came down in a row, the twins first, already dressed and neat, and they said good morning to me as they came in, looking me in the eye the way Sister Agatha looked me in the eye, which told me she'd talked to them. The 3-year-old, her name was Mercy, which I thought was a lot of name for such a small person, came down last, holding the 6-year-old's hand. Her chin was still a little oatmeal from the previous morning, which I noticed and Sister Agatha noticed, and she said something to the child quietly, and Mercy touched her own chin, and then grinned at me with all her small teeth. I sat at the head of my table and ate breakfast, surrounded by people for the first time in 7 years. It felt strange, then it felt less strange. 2 things happened in the first week that I want to tell you about straight. The first was Samuel, the 8-year-old with the bruise. He didn't talk much, he watched. He stayed close to things, walls, door frames, the corner of the kitchen near the stove, and he ate like he still wasn't sure the food was his. On the 3rd day, I was splitting wood in the yard and he came and stood about 20 feet away and watched. I split. He watched. I didn't say anything, just kept working, and after a while he came closer, and after a while longer he came close enough that I handed him the maul without a word, and he swung it at the round and missed and swung again and caught it on the edge, and on the 3rd swing split it clean. He looked up at me. I said again. We split wood for an hour. By the end he was getting most of them on the 2nd swing. He didn't say anything and I didn't say anything, and we stacked what we'd split and went back inside, and Sister Agatha looked at his face when he came in, the color in it, the different set of his jaw, and looked at me and looked away again. She didn't say anything either. She didn't need to. The second thing was about the land. On the 4th day, I rode out to the south part of the property to check the fence before it got worse, and when I came back, Thomas was on the edge of the yard watching me come in on the horse. I stepped down and he came and took the reins, not asking, just taking them, and I let him. He said, "How much ground do you run?" I said 340. He looked out at it. 14 years old, looking at my land the way a person looks at a thing they're trying to understand the size of. He said creek bottom. I said 120 of it. Rest is upland pasture, some timber. He said, "What do you run?" I said cattle, winter wheat, some corn for the animals, small kitchen garden. He said, "You work it alone." I said, "I do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I worked a ranch, before the school." He said it flat and didn't add anything to it, and I didn't reach for whatever was behind it. I said, "Walk with me tomorrow and I'll show you the south fence." He did. By the 2nd week the house had a different motion to it, the way a stream changes when new water comes in, not disrupted, just fuller. The twins, whose names were Grace and Mary, had taken to the kitchen garden, which was done for the season of course, but they studied it with a thoroughness that suggested they were already thinking about spring. The 6-year-old, whose name I only gradually learned was Rose because she barely spoke, had attached herself to the barn cats with a devotion that was almost religious. She would sit in the straw for an hour, perfectly still, waiting for a cat to come to her, and eventually they always did, which told me something about her patience that I respected. Mercy, the 3-year-old, had decided I was something she could climb on. I don't know when that started exactly. One morning she was simply on my boot, both arms around my leg, being dragged across the kitchen floor while I tried to get to the stove, and Sister Agatha was trying not to laugh, which she mostly managed but not entirely. I said, "Child." Mercy said, "Go." I dragged her to the stove and she got off and stood looking up at me with those large serious eyes, and I thought, well. On the 9th day I rode into Pell, which is the nearest town, 12 miles east. There were things we needed, and there were things I needed to know. For the needs: flour, a 2nd sack of dried beans, lamp oil, 2 boxes of cartridges for the rifle because I'd noticed I was running low and didn't like running low, and a warm coat in the boy's size because Thomas was wearing a coat that was too short in the arms and too thin in the wool, and November was not going to be the worst of it. For the knowing, I asked at the feed store what they knew about a man named Greer and land claims south of Harwick. Cal Mears runs the feed store and he knows everything that moves through the county, has for 30 years, and he didn't disappoint. He said Greer was a land speculator, had been buying up disputed claims south of the creek watershed all fall, had backing from interests in the territorial capital. Legitimate or not depended on which lawyer you asked, said Cal, and both lawyers were talking to Greer. I said, the mission school east of Harwick. Cal looked at me. He knew about the mission. He said, gone. Greer's boys put a fence around it inside of 2 days. He said it without pleasure, just reporting. I bought what I'd come for. At the dry goods I found a coat in Thomas's size, heavy canvas lined in wool, a good coat, the kind that lasts, and a pair of thicker socks for Samuel, who I'd noticed going thin-footed across the cold kitchen floor in the mornings. I put it on the bill and didn't think twice about it. Riding back, I thought about what Cal had told me and what it meant for Sister Agatha's case and what could be done about it. A speculator with territorial backing was not nothing to fight. It was, in fact, a great deal to fight. The church might fight it. They had lawyers of their own and motivation. But that would take time, and time runs in the other direction from November. What I had was a house and a farm and 340 acres, and enough put by to run through winter and into spring without distress. And I had 6 children and a woman who'd walked 9 days in the cold to get here. The math wasn't complicated. I told Sister Agatha that evening. The children were in bed or close to it. Thomas was in the barn. It was just us at the table, the stove going, the lamp between us, and I told her what I'd learned in Pell. She listened the way she always listened, fully, still, without interrupting, and when I finished she sat for a moment with her hands around her coffee cup. She said the diocese will pursue it. It will take time. I said I know. She said we cannot stay here that long. I said I'm saying you can. She looked up at me. I said through winter at least, longer if the case runs long. The house is big enough and I have enough and the children are settled. She was quiet for what felt like a long time, though it probably wasn't. She said, you understand what you're offering. I said I do. She said people will talk. I said people talk. Let them. She looked down at her cup, then up at me again, and something shifted in her face, not breaking, but giving a little, the way a thing gives when it's been held rigid too long and finally doesn't have to be. She said, why? And I thought about that. It's the kind of question that sounds simple and isn't, because the real answer has layers and most of them don't fit into sentences you'd say out loud to a person you'd known 9 days. I said, because I can. Because you walked 9 days in November with 6 children and you're still standing, and that deserves something. And because this house has been too quiet for too long, and I think maybe it doesn't have to be. She didn't say anything to that. She nodded once and that was enough. The winter settled in hard, the second week of December. I don't mean the kind of hard that's uncomfortable. I mean the kind that has intention behind it, that comes in off the northern plain with a seriousness that tells you it isn't going anywhere soon. We got 2 feet of snow in 4 days, and then a freeze that glazed it over so that the morning light hit it wrong and the yard looked like something else entirely, something you couldn't name. I worked the way I always worked, which is to say without stopping for the weather, because stopping for the weather is not a thing a man with livestock can do. Thomas worked alongside me now as a matter of course, and he was good, not just willing, which a lot of boys are when they're trying to prove something, but actually good, with a feel for the animals and a common sense about the work that you can't teach. You can teach technique. You cannot teach judgment. He had it. The children had taken on their own rhythms in the house. Sister Agatha schooled them at the kitchen table for 3 hours each morning, and I could hear it from wherever I was in the house or yard. The particular sound of a woman teaching, the question and the pause and the answer and the correction, the sound of a pencil on paper. Grace and Mary were quick and competitive about it. Samuel was slow and precise, which Sister Agatha seemed to prefer to quick. Rose learned by listening and rarely answered out loud, but when she did she was right. And Mercy disrupted everyone equally and without apparent shame. and Sister Agatha managed her with a patience I observed and could not entirely account for. In the evenings I sat by the stove, and the children brought their difficulties to me, the way children will bring difficulties to whatever solid thing is nearest. Samuel asked about the horses, the breeding of them, the individual histories, which I knew because I kept them in my head the way other men keep ledgers. The twins asked about farming, with a specificity that surprised me, yields, rotation, which fields rested which years, why the south field ran a different crop than the north. I answered straight because they asked straight. Rose sometimes sat near me without asking anything, just near, which was her version of conversation and which I understood because it was not entirely unlike my own. Thomas didn't come inside in the evenings much. He'd eaten with us from the first day, but after supper he generally went back to the barn. I didn't push it. Some people need a door they can close. One night about 3 weeks in, I found him in the barn after the others were in bed, not working, just sitting on a hay bale with his back against the wall and his arms on his knees, the horses breathing in the dark. I came in and sat on the bale across from him and didn't say anything. After a while he said, "I'm not going back to a school." I said, "Nobody said you were." He said, "Sister Agatha will want to." I said, "That's a conversation for later, not tonight." He was quiet. "Then I could work for you for real, not just because we're here." I looked at him across the lamp. 14, trying to make a thing that had dignity in it, not charity, not tolerated but useful, needed. I knew that need. I'd been inside it at different ages and understood its exact shape. I said, "I know you could. And I'd rather have you here than any hired man I've had, which is saying something because I had a good one once." He didn't say anything, but his shoulders came down, that particular drop that a body makes when it lets go of something it's been holding. I said, "Spring comes, we'll talk straight about what the arrangement is. For now just do the work which you're already doing." He said, "All right." I went back to the house. Sister Agatha was in the chair by the stove, her rosary in her hands, and she looked up when I came in. She said, "Is he all right?" I said, "He will be." She looked at me for a moment, the rosary still moving through her fingers. She said, "You're good with them." I said, "I'm just straight with them. That's all they're asking for." She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she said, quietly, more to herself than to me, "It's not all they're asking for." I went to bed and left that where it landed. Christmas came, and I am not a man who made much of Christmas, hadn't since Clara, but with the children it was not something I could let pass without acknowledging. Sister Agatha asked me, the week before, if she could use some of the flour and sugar for particular things. I said yes. She asked if the axe was sharp. I'd sharpened it in October and she could see it was, but she asked anyway, and I said yes. And on the 20th Thomas and I cut a cedar from the timber at the back of the south pasture and dragged it in on the sled. And when we brought it through the door, the children stopped whatever they were doing and looked at it like it was the first tree they'd seen indoors, which for the little ones was probably true. I had no ornaments. Clara's ornaments were in a box on the high shelf of the closet. I took the box down and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, and Sister Agatha looked at the box and at me and didn't say anything, just left it there for me to open when I was ready. I opened it that evening when the children were doing their lessons, and I sat with it for a while. The glass balls were wrapped in old newspaper, some of them Clara's from before we'd married, and I unwrapped them one by one. Most were whole. Sister Agatha came and stood near me. She didn't touch the ornaments or say Clara's name or make it into anything. She just stood near, which was the right thing, and after a while I started handing them to her one at a time, and she carried them to the tree. We hung them in the near dark. The lamp turned low, and when we lit the candles the children came from their room and stood and looked at the light catching the glass, and the littlest one, Mercy, made a sound in the back of her throat, a sound of pure involuntary astonishment, and that sound was the best thing I heard that whole year, maybe in several years. January. The diocese letter came on the 14th, forwarded through the town postmaster to me. Sister Agatha had written them of her location the first week, and they'd finally answered. The news was not good and not final. The Greer claim was being contested, but it would take months, possibly into the following year. The letter was correct and careful, and said nothing about what she should do in the interim, which was the church's way of not saying stay where you are. She showed me the letter after the children were in bed, and we sat with it for a while. She said I should begin looking for another arrangement. I cannot impose. I said, "You're not imposing." She said, "Harlan." It was the first time she'd said my name without the asterisk Mr. Cade. She'd been slipping toward it for weeks, I'd noticed, and she'd been catching herself each time and going back to formal. This time she didn't catch it. She said, "You have a life here. We have disrupted it entirely." I said, "You have." She stopped. I said, "You've disrupted it entirely, and I am not asking you to stop." She held the letter in both hands and looked at me across the table, the lamp between us. Outside, the wind was doing what January wind does in that country, which is to say moving hard and without apology across a flat world. I said, "I've been alone in this house a long time. Longer than is good for a man, I expect. I got used to it the way you get used to a thing that's become all you know. And then you knocked on my door and I set 6 bowls, and my house has been full of people for 2 months, and I have not once wanted it to go back to what it was, which surprises me. I thought I wanted the quiet." She didn't look away. I said, "I want you to stay. The children too, for as long as there's need. But I'm telling you the thing I didn't say the first time. I want you to stay because this house is better with you in it. Because you are." I stopped, found the words. I said, "You are a remarkable woman, Sister Agatha. The way you walked 9 days with those children and didn't fold. The way you manage Samuel when he goes dark, and Rose when she won't speak, and Thomas when he's trying to become something and doesn't know how to ask for help. You knew to ask me for food, and not for more than that, because you knew I was a man who'd give what was asked and bristle at what wasn't. You figured that out in about 3 minutes in the dark on my porch at 6 in the morning, and you were right. You are a remarkable woman, and I am glad you knocked on my door." The lamp moved a little in a draught somewhere, throwing a slight shadow and then righting itself. She said, "I wasn't sure I had the right to knock." I said, "You did." She looked down at the letter in her hands. Then she set it on the table and stood up, and she came around the table and she put her hand on mine, just laid it there on the back of my hand, her hand cool from the draught, small and certain, and she said, "You are a good man, Harlan Cade. I want you to know that I know that." That's all she said. She took her hand back and went to her chair by the stove, and I went to bed, and I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought, yes, all right, yes. February came in wet and then froze, and the South Road went impassable for 11 days, which meant we were entirely ourselves. I have lived through long winters alone, and I have lived through that one with 7 people, and I know without question which was better. Thomas and I, when the worst of it was on, played chess in the evenings, which surprised me because I hadn't played chess in 15 years and he'd never played it at all. But I found the board in the closet, and he took to it with that same judgment he brought to the ranch work, seeing a few moves out, not being impatient, willing to lose until he understood the losing. By February's end, he was beating me on occasion, which he tried not to show satisfaction about and didn't entirely succeed, and which I allowed myself to be pleased about. Samuel got his bruise fully healed, and with it some other things seemed to begin to heal, the way you can't always see a thing getting better until one morning you notice the evidence of it. He laughed at something Thomas said one evening at the table, a real laugh, not performed, and Sister Agatha and I looked at each other across the table for a moment. Rose was still quiet, but she'd started talking to me, specifically to me, which I took as a thing of particular significance. She'd come stand beside me in the barn when I was working and tell me about the cats, their individual characters, their habits, their preferences, which I'd been observing myself but had not bothered putting words to, and listening to her put words to them was something. She saw things with precision, that child. Had a mind that was careful and exact and needed only permission to use it. Mercy was mercy. The world was the world. She'd decided my lap was a valid place to be if she was tired, and I had no argument. Grace and Mary had mapped out, in a composition book Grace had started keeping, a kitchen garden plan for the following spring that covered 2 more beds than I currently maintained and included 3 varieties I hadn't grown. They presented it to me one Sunday evening at the table with the seriousness of a land survey, pointing to the sketched rows and explaining the reasoning, and I looked at it and looked at them and said I didn't see why not, and they looked at each other with a satisfaction they managed not to make too loud. March. The diocese sent another letter. Progress on the Greer claim. A settlement was being discussed. The mission land might be recoverable. It would be decided before June. Sister Agatha and I talked about it at the table late, the children in bed. She was different than she'd been in November, not softened. That's not the word. She was never soft, but settled, in the way a person settles when they've been given time to stop running. She said, if the land is recovered and the mission re-established, I will need to go back. I said, I know. She said, the children would come with me. I said, I know that too. She said, Harlan. I said, I'm not asking you to change what you are. I never was. She looked at me, a long look, the lamp, the stove, 4 months of evenings at this table. She said, what are you asking? And here is the thing about that. I am not a man built for asking. I spent a long time not asking for things because the cost of the answer being no was higher than the cost of not asking, and eventually you stop reaching for things and call it self-sufficiency and believe your own account of it. This woman had knocked on my door and disrupted all of that. She'd walked into my house and put her hand on mine and told me I was a good man like she knew it for a fact, and not like she was trying to be kind. I said, I'm asking you to know that this is yours too, the house, the farm, as long as you need it to be, and I'm asking you to let me write to the diocese myself about the mission, about the children, about the arrangement here, and we'll see what can be made that works. And I'm asking. I stopped. I said, I'm asking you to stay after. When the case is settled and the mission question is answered and you've got a choice in front of you, I want you to know that this is a choice, that there is a man here who would be glad of your company for the rest of his life, if that were a thing you could choose. And I'm not asking you to answer tonight. She was very still. Then she said, I am not a woman who makes this kind of choice lightly. I said, I know, that's why I'm asking you. She looked at the table for a long moment, then she looked at me. She said, write the letter to the diocese. April opened up cold and then warm, the way April does in that country, fighting itself. The snow going gray, and then the mud coming, and the mud a thing I'd always hated, and then that year not minding it much because the mud meant the ground was alive again. Grace and Mary planted the first beds the second week of the month. Thomas and I pulled the South Fields fence line and reset 3 posts that had gone soft over winter. Samuel helped, and he was good at the post setting, better than me at holding the post true while Thomas and I swung the mauls, and he knew it and stood straighter for it. Sister Agatha planted a row of sweet peas along the south side of the house, in a strip of ground Clara had once kept, that I hadn't touched since. She asked me first. I said, plant whatever you want. She planted sweet peas and a row of something else, a herb I didn't know the name of, and the strip of ground was busy and particular in a way it hadn't been in 7 years, and I did not mind it at all. The diocese settlement came through in May. The Greer claim, under pressure from the church's lawyers and the Territorial Land Office, was deemed invalid on the original survey. The mission land was returned to the diocese. Sister Agatha received the letter on a Thursday. She read it at the table and set it down and sat very still. I said, "Good news." She said, "Yes." I said, "What happens now is up to you." She sat with it. I let her sit with it. She said, "The mission will take months to reestablish. The other sisters are in different placements. The children are enrolled in no school, and I have." She stopped. She said, "I have written to my mother superior about the possibility of a rural mission differently organized, not a school building, a family setting, the children who have nowhere else." I did not tell her where. I told her the arrangement had proven viable. I said, "What did she say?" Sister Agatha looked up at me. Something in her face I hadn't seen quite that way before, not quite composed, not quite not. She said that God works in the places he finds room. The kitchen was quiet, the stove. Outside, Grace and Mary in the garden, their voices carrying faint. Thomas somewhere in the barn, the sound of him. Mercy, who had been following the barn cats all morning, crossed the window just then, running after one, both legs going at that lurching 3-year-old run, completely committed. I said, "There is room here." Sister Agatha looked at me across the table, the lamp not lit because it was day, the light coming clear through the east window, spring light, thinner and truer than winter light, and she said, with those direct dark eyes on mine, "Yes, there is. I am telling you this the way I remember it, which is the only way I know. I am not going to tell you what it all added up to, or what lesson you should take from a man who was eating oatmeal alone in a cold kitchen when a woman knocked at his door. I don't think there is a lesson. I think there is just a door and a knock, and what you do with it. What I did was set 6 bowls. What happened after that is everything I've been telling you. It is June now, and the sweet peas along the south wall are coming in purple and white, and there is a kitchen garden twice the size it was last year, and Thomas has become the kind of hand I didn't think I'd have on this place again, working with a judgment and a willingness that makes the days shorter and the work easier and the land better for having him on it. Samuel can split a cord in a day, ask me to teach him to ride, and I am teaching him. Rose is quiet and exact, and tells me things about the animals on this farm that I have lived with for years and somehow missed, and she is always right. Grace and Mary are planning the fall planting already, and I suspect they will have strong opinions about the winter wheat. Mercy has learned to say my name. It comes out Harlan. She can't manage the H yet, so it comes out *Arlen*, and she says it whenever she wants something, which is frequently. And I cannot explain why that is the sound I want to hear for the rest of my life, except that it is. And Sister Agatha is here. She is in the garden now, kneeling in the dirt with the good smell of turned earth coming in the open window where I'm sitting writing this down, and she has taken off her coif because it's warm and the sun is in her hair, and she is talking to Grace about something. I can't hear the words, and Grace is laughing at something she said, and I am watching from the window like a man who has been given back something he didn't know he'd lost. I am 62 years old. My hands are the color of this country. My wife Clara is in the churchyard in Pell with a good stone over her, and I remember her with nothing but respect and sorrow and love, and I believe she would have recognized what this is and said, "Good, finally, good." A homeless woman knocked at my door at dawn and asked me to feed her children, and I did. And here is where that goes. And I am grateful for the knock, and I am grateful I answered it, and I am grateful I had enough, which it turns out I did. The sweet peas are purple and white along the south wall. The farm is full. That is all I need to tell you.